Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our 33rd COVID-19 webinar. And oh, by the way, I'll mention this at the very end. We are looking at a renaming process and would love your feedback on it. But just know that as this is our 33rd get-together, if we were a human being, we would be in the middle of our millennial years. So I want to thank all of you who are here, and also for those of you who attended Builder 100 in Laguna Beach last week. It was an amazing experience. You'll hear a couple things about that today, but the content and the connections were incredible. And keep your eyes out for Future Place, because that's going to be another gathering where we're focused on how to create the great place of the future. That'll be October 3rd and 4th in Dallas. And before we get going, I want to remind everybody, we'll have the recording available within a day of this. And please submit questions. We're always willing and able and absolutely want to hear what you say, because it helps Allie and I really direct what we're going to do our research around. Now, two quick reminders before we get started. One of which is, I think many of you know that our organization Zonda was the combination of Myers Research and Metro Study, and combining those databases has created Enterprise. And it's, we think, the most complete data solution you'll find for home builders. It's unbelievably visually appealing. And we've also got the Mortgage Pro product. And important to this, we've added in the multiple listing service data across the country. And I had some conversations with a few lenders at Builder 100, and the feedback has been absolutely terrific. And once again, because of the visualization and the capability of being able to see that research on the screen so clearly is definitely a highlight. And we, like we say every time we're together, we're here to help with our advisors and researchers and technologists. But really, the technologists I want to acknowledge today, because the work that they're putting in to upgrade and update all of what we're doing from the research side is unbelievable. There's smoke coming out of their ears all the time. And also allow me to say and offer a very hearty welcome to Todd Tomalek, who's just joined us a month ago. He is leading our BPM practice on the advisory side. Todd is an incredibly smart person, great thinker, wonderful teammate. And Todd, we are so glad to have you with us. Today's agenda, you can see we've got 8 points, and Allie and I will split them in half. And I want to give Allie the appropriate introduction that she deserves as our chief economist. And as many of you know, she's got quite the educational background, including her master's from the London School of Economics. And Allie, I wanted to make sure you knew I'm going to London at the end of the month, and I'm going to stop into your old stomping grounds, take some pictures and ask them what they remember about you, and see where I can find your pictures on the wall. Now, important about Allie is that the depth to which she is bringing our research right now is pretty significant. And just in the last 2 weeks, she has met with a number of mortgage associations, a 55+ community developer, a public home builder, and a number of BPM, building product manufacturing companies. She's doing this because she's trying to pull together the what if. What if things change? And as they change, what do we do about it? And that really is the focus of today. The factors that we're going to talk about and the things that Allie is driving through our research have to do with the concerns that all of you have. But one last thing about Allie. If you follow her on LinkedIn, you might have seen in the last couple of days, she snapped a shot of her father and stepmother, and she was able to take them out to dinner this week. And she reminded us that the little things matter. And whether it's the little things for people you love and being able to see them, or the little things about connecting the dots that don't seem as relevant until you put them all together, that's what Allie's great at. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the virtual stage our chief economist and my dear friend, Allie Wolf.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And I'm so jealous you're going to London. Please, you'll find my pictures all over the campus. So yeah,
I can't wait.
Send me when you find those. So hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us on our 33rd webinar. As you heard, probably next time you join, it will be branded differently, but we'll still go through a lot of the same things. Now, as you saw on the agenda, Tim and I have a lot to cover throughout these 60 minutes. So let's just get started right away. And I want to start by linking what's happening in the economy and with policy to what's happening in the housing market. And that's the main focus today, some of the shifts that we're seeing and how we're taking in all of these new pieces of information. But the first place to go is to just make sense of some seemingly contradictory information on the economic front. And again, we'll talk about how what happens from the economy impacts us in housing. But let's go back to last Friday. We had a stellar jobs report, 428,000 jobs added in April, our unemployment rate at 3.6%. We right now have nearly 2 job openings for every unemployed individual. That is the highest level that we have on record. So we know that the backdrop from the labor market is extremely strong. We know that companies that are looking to attract or retain workers are finding they have to raise wages to do so. Data out this morning. This is from the Atlanta Federal Reserve. They track wages, 6% wage growth compared to last year. At this point, all of these points make sense. They flow. This is not the contradictory information that we're looking at. Layering in another piece that flows, that makes sense, is looking at inflation. Whether you're looking at the personal consumption expenditures index or the consumer price index, both of them are telling us that, geez, we're not seeing that relief on inflation just yet. The CPI, the bottom number there, 8.3%, that came out yesterday. The expectation was that we were going to see a slower pullback. We weren't going to see as high of a level of inflation. It was 8.5% year over year last month, 8.3 today, showing still that inflation is near the highest level in 40 years. And it's impacting Americans from a lot of things that they're seeing on a daily basis, whether that's gas. If you've tried to book a flight, you probably know how crazy flight costs have gotten. Food, health insurance, housing, we'll talk about that. So that's starting to capture the idea that we're in an overheating economy where we should have inflation around 2%. But at this point, all of these are pointing to, okay, things are good. The problem is things are too good. And so I say that, and then you probably saw the GDP report, gross domestic product, the broadest measure of the overall economy. It was negative for the first quarter. And what you have to understand is the devil is in the details here. A couple of the factors that pulled down GDP, one of them was our ballooning trade deficit. One of them was last year. Remember, there was this ramp up of inventory. This year, there's still a lot of inventory that businesses are holding, but the base effect, which means how do you compare it to last year, actually had a little bit of pull down in that number. So those are a couple of the factors that pulled down GDP. Some of the more important ones to tell you directionally, what are we seeing with some of the big fundamental parts of the economy? Consumer and business spending, both of those independently up over 2%. Now, adding an additional discrepancy or another piece of contradictory information, if you look at consumer, some of the soft data, some of the sentiment data, consumers don't feel that great, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about how much they're paying every day, whether it's about the housing market. Not many people think now is a good time to buy, but that goes back to how do we put it together that consumer spending is still holding up and is still holding up exceptionally strong. So for GDP, headline number, more noise than anything. And the Federal Reserve was aware of that. And that's why we've now seen our second short-term rate increase this year, 50 basis points. That was what the Federal Reserve had told us they were likely going to do. Again, still trying to raise those interest rates to get inflation back down and back in check. Where we are right now, the federal funds rate, that short-term interbank lending, the number that the Federal Reserve controls, is up 75 basis points. At the same time that mortgage rates are up 200 plus basis points. And remember, we've talked about this in the past. Why is this happening? Well, it's because the market isn't waiting for the Fed. We've talked about the relationship with the 10-year, and this is so interesting. Just in the past 10 days, I've had quotes of mortgage rates, not that I'm looking to buy, but I'm talking to loan officers asking, what are you quoting today? I've heard 5.25, and I've heard 5.75. And that goes back to, remember, on these different webinars, I tell you, 10-year treasury, try to look at it when you wake up, try to look at it at lunch, try to look at it at the end of the day. That's the number that I think is the most important. This morning, we're at least below 3. We had been above 3, and that was supporting that 5.75, that 5.75% mortgage rate, basically getting close to that 6% level. Now, as Tim mentioned, I have been on the speaking circuit a lot recently. So if you have seen me present, the next couple of slides you've seen me talk about before, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Because what we then have to do is saying, if we're now getting close to 6% interest rates, probably not that high again because the 10-year has come down today, but we've seen that rapid increase. What's the response on the ground? And we at Zonda, most of you know, we're tracking land and lots and actively selling communities and price points and sales and all of these different stats. But we also like to supplement that with our division president survey. We want to hear on the ground, hey, this is a topical question. What are we seeing qualitatively to layer in a piece of information? Now, we collected this data a little over 2 weeks ago. It's still some of the most fresh data on how the market is responding to mortgage rates so far. And what we see is about 30% of builders said that demand was slower than they expected. You have more than 60% that said demand was either on track with what they expected or stronger than what they expected. And remember that 60% plus, because I'm going to hit on that a few times throughout today's presentation. But what this really captures is the idea that builders are seeing different responses to what's happening with affordability and rising interest rates, and consumers are having different reactions to what's happening. You have some buyers that are motivated by the market. Home prices are up, mortgage rates are up, inventory hasn't turned a corner yet. People have that fear of missing out. If I don't buy today, I may never be able to, and that's still propelling the market forward. You also have some people that are looking at the market and saying, inflation's 8.3%. My costs are going up everywhere. I want to lock the largest share of my monthly budget. I want to get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. You also have some buyers that are deterred. They're deterred by choice. So instead of fear of missing out, there are some people that have the fear of buying at the top. And then there are some buyers that are deterred by force. And what does force mean? Force means how quickly the math has changed when you're looking to buy a home. So here what we're looking at. Thank you, Nick Schoolis on our team for helping with this. We also have a new PhD economist on our team, John Massaros. So excited that he's here too to help us run some of the quant modeling that we're looking at. But when we look at what has happened to the monthly payment, this is the year end. This is the end of last year when our interest rate was at 3.1%. We've pulled that forward. We said, okay, let's just say 5.25 makes sense for what the interest rate is at today. If you look at Las Vegas, Tampa, Raleigh, Jacksonville, Orlando, Austin, you're talking a 40% change in the monthly payment since the end of last year. This is including both home price appreciation and the change in mortgage rates. You see those metros that are listed at the top. You will see me reference them a little bit later that in a way kind of supports the change. This has been rapid. This is not what people expected. You can see in Las Vegas, the average payment has gone from about $1,400 a month to almost $1,900 a month. And one of the questions that we get quite often is, okay, we know interest rates are going up. What are we seeing with adjustable rate mortgages? How is that playing into the market? What kind of relief is that offering? So the first thing I want to offer up is, remember, I said I was calling different loan officers. One of the quotes that I showed you, the 5.75% for the 30-year fixed, their adjustable rate was still at 5%. So yes, it's a lower level, but it's not that the ARMs are going to get you still that 3% interest rate that we saw in the past. But as you look at adjustable rates, here's the context. During the height of last cycle, we had 35% of loans that were going out that were adjustable rate. During the trough, going into the pandemic, we had about 3% that were adjustable rate. The most recent data came out and we're at 11%. So nowhere near as high as last cycle, but definitely seeing the increasing use of ARMs as people are trying to figure out how can we make this affordability work. Now note, ARMs are not inherently bad. I can't tell you how many people I've met recently that have had ARMs for years and love them, but we do know that there were some of the problems associated with last cycle when the payment reset and then people found themselves unable to purchase. So let's go back to this. 40% change in some markets based on how prices and interest rates have gone up. If you've listened to this webinar regularly, you know Tim and I call it the compound effect. And probably no surprise that we now have an increasing share of builders that are saying they're seeing some contract cancellations. 35% of builders that we talked to said their cancellations are increasing, but there are a couple of things you need to know. One is we're coming from basically no cancellations. It's a very, very small share of the market. And generally when cancellations have been happening, there's been a buyer that is on the interest list that's going to purchase the home. I would say that's still the case today. There are still enough people that want to purchase a home that most of the time those canceled homes get purchased. But it is showing what we're capturing is this inflection point. The idea that we didn't have many cancellations as a share of the overall market, it's still not a high percent. It's just that we're having some people on the margin, again, by force, by choice, deciding to step aside. So we're saying an inflection point, partly from what we're seeing in the monthly payment, partly from what we're seeing in cancellations, and also partly this increased use of incentives. Similar to cancellations, incentives were basically non-existent in the market over the past couple of years. You haven't had to give people a reason to decide to keep buying a home or closing a home. Right now, 16% of builders reported an increased use of incentives. 16%, not very high, but you are seeing that that goes to the idea of that kind of inflection point, just little shifts that we're starting to pick up on. And luckily in our Zonda database, we can go look at the different markets. We can look at what the incentives are, what dollar amount, what percent of the overall market. And I know from talking to Nicolette Chapman, she runs our mortgage division. I talked to her about how we have this large cluster of these incentives that are the closing cost with preferred lender. And from her and from her experience, she's like, well, that's just low hanging fruit. Maybe you need to give people a little bit of money to sweeten the deal, but ultimately it's not telling us at that point that there's a lot of money getting thrown in. It is just a little bit to maybe push some of those buyers over. But let's go back. Let's go back to the point that we said still 60% plus of builders said the market was still doing just fine. And you see that backed up in the pricing data. I'm going to show you March data at first by market, then I'll show you the builder survey data through April. Tim's going to give you more specific details later in the presentation. So in March, we still had 80 to 90% of each of the actively selling communities across the country that were raising prices. In April, we had 84% of builders that reported raising prices month over month. Again, this is mid-month. It's not all the way through the end of April, but that was our way to supplement some of the stats. For context, from February to March, 97% of builders raised prices. From March to April, 84. Down a little bit, but still 84 is telling you price increases continue to happen across the board. And they're happening for a lot of reasons. Even if costs aren't running away as much as they were in the past, we still have higher land costs, labor costs, material costs, and in some cases, those costs are continuing to go up. And as they do, there's still the pricing power, whether you are a home builder, whether you're an existing home seller, inventory remains constrained. New home community count, anywhere where there are 5 or more units for sale, still has not turned a corner nationally. Active listings, as you look at this, you can see April, a little bit of an increase. We have not converged with 2021 yet, but maybe seeing a little bit of relief on the resale side modestly, because again, look at the history of where we were in the early days of 2020, still day and night on that front. And that's part of the discussion, is as we have the interest rates go up and as we have the demand pool come down, for now, we still have more people that are willing to buy a home than homes that are available on the ground. So let's go into it. Let's talk about who is in the place to continue to buy homes, who is in the place that's going to get the most hit. We're looking at today's shoppers. Again, we're going to go to our division president survey, and luckily we've been doing this now for the past 2 years. So we're able to look at this data and trend it over time. And when we look at the most active shoppers, a year ago and the same today, the number one most active move up shoppers. And I'll show some stats on that in a moment about some of the reasons that move up shoppers are still in a reasonably better place than some others. The number 2, still tied with where we were last year, entry-level buyers, but look at that change. April 21 versus 22, you can see that entry-level share coming down, just having more and more entry-level buyers that are finding this market difficult to navigate. And then look over halfway through, besides investors, which is a modest increase, relocation shoppers actually had a notable increase in the share of activity. And I know, again, if you've joined this webinar on a regular basis, you know we talk about migration a lot. I'm going to keep doing so, especially in a rising rate environment and especially in an environment where those relocation shoppers, again, are becoming increasingly important. So let's go to the market. Let's go back to that 60% and let's remember what happened during the pandemic. We had people and individuals that became, as long as they were in the right sector, as long as they remained employed, as long as they had some money diversified in the economy, we saw people gain wealth. And when you're looking at those wealth shoppers and you're looking at rising interest rates, there's a little bit of a buffer that comes from that. From the new home market, we have an increasing share of builders that are saying they have more and more of their sales that are going to cash buyers. Earlier, I talked about that 40% change in the average mortgage monthly payment. Most of that change, some of it was home price appreciation. A lot of it was the change in interest rate. These cash buyers, not as sensitive to that. And when you think of the cash, some of the cash can come from the stock market, some of the cash can come from your home equity, different forms, different investments. But what I wanted to look at is we know some of the money has come from people tapping the money that they had either in their 401k or just in some of their day trading accounts. And I want to pause here. And if you've seen me again present in the past month, you've seen me talk about the S&P 500 and how that has been, I'm using this just as our general gauge for the stock market, just kind of looking at an index here. And what I said, and if you guys remember, is I said, hey, this year started off a little bit bumpy. We had the Fed policy changes that were expected. We had the higher level of inflation. We have the horrific events that are happening in Ukraine. That's created some volatility. And just a few weeks ago, I was saying, but look at the long-term trend. If you had money in the S&P 500 a few weeks ago, you were still up 99% over the past 5 years. Now, context is important. This has changed. If you look at the 5-year trend, you still are up. You're still up 65%. But I can't tell you the amount of people that I've talked to recently that have said, geez, I wish I did not look at my stock portfolio. I feel a lot less wealthy than I did. There's a longer term, that's that 5-year trend of growth. And then you can look at the year to date down 20%. And I bring this up because this has been a really positive wealth effect, really positive factor for the housing market. And we're not in the business of forecasting the stock market, but I think as we're looking at this, I want to link it back to the first slide I showed you when we were talking about the Fed increases, 2 of 7. Remember, last time we met, I said, just because the Fed says they're going to do 7 doesn't mean they have to. If the market slows, if the market reacts quicker than they expected, they're not going to have to do 7 rate increases. And a question that I don't necessarily have the answer to right now, and I think it depends on how the market continues to progress, is do the financial markets honestly do the job for the Fed? Because if you have the wealth effect coming down because people are looking at what has happened recently in the stock market, you have interest rates going up because of what's happening in the 10-year and how that's impacting mortgage rates and how that's impacting the housing market, you may not have to see as many rate increases as originally highlighted. But let's go back. I want to keep going and keep talking about what we're seeing with the people that are continuing to buy today that are not so sensitive to interest rates. And another group besides cash buyers, besides wealth buyers, would be, of course, your relocation buyers. We love talking about this because of how important the relocation buyers have been in the housing market. So if you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, you've already seen this chart, but just in case you didn't, this is the updated data that came out from the US Census Bureau. Here, what you're looking at are the areas that have a population of 1 million plus, more people moving in than moving out. Think back to the chart I showed you at the beginning with the biggest payment change. A lot of those markets overlapped here with the markets that have the more people moving in some cases bringing their equity with them, in some cases seeing more job diversity, increasing incomes that are driving up home prices and keeping inventory tight. So as we look at those relocation buyers, people moving for many different reasons. In a lot of cases, they can tap their equity. They can, again, if you're in California, tap that $117,000 over the past year and head over to Florida or head over to Phoenix. We have people moving for tax reasons, for weather reasons, for lifestyle change reasons, and also for affordability reasons. We know that that was a driver for some people where they were saying, hey, maybe I need more space right now, or I don't want to, I'm going to be spending more time in my home because I'm working from home. I just want more bang for my buck. So what we were looking at, and this is something that Nick and I have talked a lot about when we're looking at the markets, is saying, okay, when you look at Austin's home price appreciation, it is still, Tim's going to show it later, still really high numbers. And we're saying, does the relative value of Austin to somewhere like San Francisco go down? And then are people less likely to want to move? And so we wanted to pool some common paths of migration, a departing city and arriving city. And what was that spread? What was that compelling reason to move in the past? And what is it today? Go to the bottom of the table. San Francisco to Austin, LA to Dallas, San Francisco to Sacramento. Those arriving cities have become very expensive relative to themselves. Look at Austin, the bottom one. Austin used to be 72% cheaper than San Francisco. Now it's 61% cheaper. Yes, the prices are going up. And yes, the price growth is a little bit faster than what we're seeing in San Francisco, but there's still that really strong, compelling reason. At the top of this, what we're watching is for those narrowing spreads. Doesn't necessarily mean those markets can't continue to grow, but some of that absolute value is getting taken away. One of the common paths from Denver to Boise. Boise used to be 35% cheaper. Today it's 14. Those are the kind of numbers that we're tracking and we'll be tracking on a monthly basis to see how they evolve. But I also want to give some love to markets outside of that graph that you see, because if you've joined Tim and I, you've seen that graph many, many times of those migration markets. We also wanted to look at where are the top domestic net migration markets regardless of population. Now, the small population, going back to base effect, may post a larger percent share, which is why we don't always include this. But when you look at this top 20, I thought it was really interesting. These are some markets that some of you may be looking at it and say, I don't even think I could point to that market on a map if you asked me to. You're seeing some of those smaller markets really starting to grow. And what I thought was funny is I like to look at the migration data from the Census Bureau, and then I like to supplement it with how it applies to housing. And many of you know Redfin or Realtor.com, they can track migration trends from where people searching from one market to another. When I went for these 20 markets, I could only find 4 of these markets that were actually publicly available. So these big companies are saying, we think these 4 markets are ones that actually have scale. The other ones, not even big enough that they're regularly reported on or regularly requested on. Doesn't mean there's not data there behind the scenes, but you know what's publicly facing. So the 4 that were captured, Myrtle Beach, Cape Coral, Boise, Bend. Each of these have between 55 and 70% of all of the searches for housing that are still coming from outside the market. Looking back at that list though, I'm sure a lot of you saw a lot of FLs, lots and lots of Florida. 60% of these top come from Florida. And so I reached out to Christine Smale. She is our senior vice president and our Southeast expert. And I said, hey, Christine, look at these. There's actually a couple markets in Florida. I don't know where they are. And I said, what are you seeing? What are the commonalities? And what Christine said is the top markets for migration in Florida are generally lower priced areas outside of the larger metros, indicating that these relocating are driven by a value proposition. These cities are generally more affordable, but within commuting distance of Tampa, Orlando, and West Palm Beach. And I want you to think of that last sentence that she said, within a reasonable commuting distance of other major employment centers where people may have their job. Now, I bring this up because a lot of times we're talking about migration from one metro to another, but also there's that inner metro or within a reasonable area of where people are moving. And a lot of that comes back to a common theme that Tim and I have talked about over the years, which is that freedom that comes from either the hybrid schedule or the work from home schedule. So I want to show new data that Nick sent over from Morgan Stanley. And a couple of things I want to hit on here. The first is if you remember, if you've been part of this webinar series for a while, you remember that Jeff Myers, he's our CEO. He is looking at different things at a high level. And one of the things that he called out is he said, hey, I think the office space, I think we haven't actually felt the full shakeout yet because of the long lease terms that we have. And we still haven't seen that full shakeout. But this new data that came out is there are 75% of companies that are looking to reduce their office footprint. And maybe their lease is still going, so we don't know that besides this survey and the soft data. Office space demand, it was calculated, is going to decline by 14% over the next 3 years. And that's as companies have looked at their teams and said, you know what, some of our teams are more productive, they're doing better work, they're happier, they like the flexibility. And so 75% of employers that were done in this survey expect employees to work from home 3+ days a week, which again becomes really important to housing and where and how people are willing to live. Now, here's an interesting point though, because we know people can move. We know that there's the flexibility. We know there's some of the wealth that's baked into it. But I think the question becomes, will they move, especially given the changes that we've seen in mortgage rates? So the data I'm showing you here is from Black Knight, and we're double checking that this data is fine. We've had a lot of back and forth with their team, and it seems like this is capturing the data correctly. 90% of homeowners today have a mortgage rate under 5%. Remember the lock-in effect. Remember 2018, we talked about the lock-in effect. Today, you have a lot of people that have a very low interest rate, and what's going to be their reason for moving? Now, one thing to note, we're talking about mortgage rates today. I did not use the R word. recession so far, but if we fall into a recession, you should see interest rates come back down. So this is really kind of a lock-in effect until we see the interest rate environment start to change. So we look at this, and I think there's the expectation that there is going to be some lack of mobility for some people because of an unwillingness to reset their interest rate. But we also have to think about, why do people buy? So people may be buying because they're working from home, they want to live somewhere else. Maybe they need to size up, maybe they need to size down, maybe they're having kids, maybe they're getting a divorce. There's different reasons that force people to move that doesn't completely halt the market. But what to me this calls out is the importance of, if we believe the lock-in effect is going to be real, at least for some time, who is the group that we can continue to purchase? It would be those that don't already own. Now, we know that those don't already own. We've seen a decreasing share of that because of affordability. But I want to take the discussion there quickly, looking at our millennials. Many of you know, we at Zonda, we love studying millennials. I have been doing millennial surveys for years at this point. And what we've seen consistently is only between 2 and 5% of millennials never want to own. The rest want to. Homeownership is absolutely part of the dream. Now, we have things like 14% of millennials that want to buy as soon as possible, but limited inventory is holding them back. 30% of millennials that want to buy in the next 1 to 3 years. This group is so important, largest living generation. We've talked at length about them. And again, because it's my specialty, it's a sector I really like to research, you're going to see a little bit of our proprietary stats in this. But as we look at millennials, what we know is 4 of the top 5 reasons why they don't own have to do with affordability. I can't afford in general, can't afford in the location I like, I can't come up with a down payment, and I have student loans. And those 2 points become important in today's dynamic environment because we still have policy supporting 41 million student loan holders who have not had to make a payment since the beginning of the pandemic. They have not accrued interest. They have not had a penalty. And those that were able to remain employed actually were in a place to save for that down payment. You can see the distribution. You see student loans across each different age groups, larger share between those millennials and Gen Z. In San Antonio, in Cincinnati, in Houston, in Louisville, in Tampa, Indianapolis, you have a 6 to 7% down payment. I've shown this before. It used to be 3 to 4%. We have the student loan forbearance going through August of this year, and that's been really important. And it's allowed many millennials to buy homes. So to step back, I would say about probably 10 years ago, the idea was, when are millennials going to buy homes? And then over the past 5 years, it's been, millennials are buying homes. And then you see that we have this new layer, which is there are a lot of millennials that are move up buyers as well. So here, what you're looking at is the millennial homeownership rate. We pulled some of the top markets across the country. Know that the millennial homeownership rate, depending on the source that you're looking at, is averaging between 35 and about 45% nationally. Minneapolis, Detroit, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Salt Lake, Indy, Charlotte, you can see these are 60-ish% plus of that overall millennial homeownership rate. In this case, you have more diversity of shoppers when you're thinking about this cohort and what jobs they have and what incomes they have and what they want in their home. But what we've done is every year we've asked the millennials that already owned, which was a smaller share in the past and obviously an increasing share today, what square footage do you have? 44% of millennials from our data at the end of last year and into the early days of this year owned a home under 2,000 square feet. Consistently, it was 70%. And before you think it's maybe a data collection error on our end, what this is really capturing is that you had a lot of millennials that for their first time home, they were looking under 2,000 square feet. They were absolutely interested, willing, as long as it was done right, it checked their boxes, they would move forward. Now we have the capture of those millennials that are move up, those millennials that maybe wanted more space because of the pandemic, or those that moved. But as we look at priorities, what are the biggest preferences? I think the understanding of what kind of square footage is accepted, Tim will talk about that a little bit later. Many are still okay with under 2,000 square feet, almost regardless of the location. You also want to know what matters to them with their neighborhood. And the answer is it kind of varies whether they have kids, but you'll see a lot of commonalities here. So those that don't have kids, their priority will be something walkable with restaurants and shops and making sure they have some safety. Those that are planning to have kids, you see good schools comes into the interest, but still walkability, still some safety, still those access to restaurants and shops. Those that have kids, and as you look at the distribution of millennials by age, those that want to have kids or those that already have kids are those that are between, well, really starting 28 and older. When you look at it an average, of course, it will totally depend on the person, but you're seeing that we're at that cluster where you have the largest share right now of the millennial population falling at the average age that we also see people having kids. Good schools, safety, distance to work. So I have 2 minutes left to just wrap things up. And as we're looking at the millennials, we're enthusiastic about this group. We know what they want. We know, Tim will talk a little bit later about how we should measure what they're willing to pay for, but they also will be the most sensitive to affordability. And as we're looking at affordability, I know I went through who can buy, who is buying, but I absolutely want to recognize the thing that keeps me up at night is that price ceiling, is that compound effect, is that 40% change in the monthly payment in just 5 months. And the fact that we have an increasing share of builders that are saying they're running into pre-qualified buyers, no longer qualified, general qualification issues, hesitancy from buyers, the idea that some builders are saying they're hitting a wall with their buyers. And as you look at the top things to watch, we have a whole list. I wish I could tell you that there's one thing to look at, but there isn't. Different data comes out on different schedules, 1 month lag, 2 month lag, weekly data, survey data. I listed out some of the things that I think are important. The homes selling within 2 weeks, the homes with price drops, what's happening with credit scores, what's happening with cancellations, bidding wars, layering in qualitative research. Don't discount discussions that you're having because those become some of those early warning signs as well. And also headlines. So my last slide here. As we're looking at the math is really important. But in 2018, the housing market slowed after interest rates hit 5%. We can almost pinpoint it to the day when the headlines turned really negative on housing and we saw a response to some of the overall consumer spending. To me, I think it's the math plus confidence. And right now, the good news is the headlines are still in our favor. Look at that bottom one, waiting for home prices to drop. You'll likely be waiting for a long time. Housing crash, unlikely. Record high home prices, rising mortgage rates, and a glimmer of hope for home buyers. I think if you're looking at other things to watch, I had that last slide listing off a lot of the categories that we're watching regularly. Also track how the headlines trend. So with that, Tim, I know I ran a minute long, but let me just introduce him so he can get through the rest of the presentation. You guys know Tim, he is our Senior Managing Principal of Advisory. He leads our entire custom market study business, from our built to rent research to our master plan strategies and general feasibility studies. Before I pass things over to Tim, you heard at the beginning, Tim mentioned our Builder 100 event. Just some major kudos to our team, from programming to design to marketing to events, who thought through every detail. It was such an amazing event. But at that Builder 100 conference, Tim played a key role as our MC. For 3 days, Tim did introductions, connected the dots of the sessions and presentations, facilitated panels, and provided comprehensive conclusions and takeaways from the audience. Tim makes it look so easy, but the amount of work that happens behind the scenes is immeasurable. He's working on weekends, he's working at nights, he's doing everything he can to make sure that it's the best event possible. So Tim, we appreciate it. I'm sorry for running long. Let me pass it to you.
Ali, it is absolutely my pleasure. And as always, my yellow pad is covered in notes, and particularly when you speak. And Ali, you talked about so many important things, and I want to make sure some of these sink in, ladies and gentlemen, because Ali was talking about the little things mattering, and that's where I'm going to head with a couple of questions, Ali. But there's still good news out there, but there's also compelling news that makes us ask, now what? And we should be asking that, and we should be thinking ahead 3 or 4 steps on what it means for our home building companies, for our BPMs, for our mortgage companies. And a couple of the key things that are just those little details: office space. You know, Jeff Myers has always said to us that housing is actually competitive to office space. So on the office side, will we see increasing number of pivots that put office into a housing type of use? I think we will. And the student loan deferral, Ali, that's such an important little detail. But let's talk about the inflection point. This is the first of 3 very quick questions. I'm always looking for the canary in the coal mines. We're looking at cancellations, price increases, incentives, inventory, underwriting. For me, if I have to pick one, it's unsold inventory as an indicator of market direction. If you pick one indicator for, just coaching people to pay attention to, what would you choose?
I love yours. I would add price drops on either the new or resale side.
I love it. So we're going to pay attention to that. Secondly, you and I have had this conversation before. Technical definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction. We actually had a couple questions from the audience about that. Since we've already had 1 quarter, do you think we're already in a technical recession?
So there are different definitions of a recession. Let me give a really quick. The National Bureau of Economic Research does not define it as 2 consecutive quarters of a GDP contraction. They are the organization that calls recessions. They call for a slowdown in the economy spread across multiple sectors that lasts multiple months. So they do not have to wait for 2 consecutive quarters. They're just looking for the data to turn negative. Historically, the sign that you've fallen into a recession is that job growth turns negative. We have not seen that. I do not believe we're in a recession right now or in the early days of it.
That's terrific. Thank you. And one last question. This is really one of our true false questions. We will see 40-year mortgages in the market before too long. True or false?
I think true.
Thank you. Allie, as always, thank you to you and Nick and John and the entire team. Great stuff. And fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, because we are going to get moving. And when we bring you to the herd on the street element, this is the feedback we're getting from builders and developers in the BPM world. And notice in these first 4 points, it's basically that we're seeing some good news still, but cycle times, which I'm going to talk about again, boy, they're still not helping us. Some other points that we look at, we're seeing slight incentives, but note what Allie said. They're by far and away focused on mortgage and financing. So we're not seeing giveaways yet, important factor. As we think about the way that builders have been dealing with their sales, look at the right side of this graphic. And taking contract sales only as lots are ready, taking a pause. When you really look at that, it's the metering element that's happening that we still see as a focal point. And we're seeing this move more and more towards holding back product, but also we don't have the product because of supply chain issues. So this is possibly the good news cloaked in the bad news side of things because of that supply control and the limit that we're seeing on product that's out there. There might even be some good news on the horizon. We've been paying attention on a monthly basis to all of the building products and what's happening and who's improving and who's worsening. You can see at the bottom, garage doors, cabinets, and HVAC, they've had some of the biggest issues. But where are we seeing improving conditions? Well, lumber, and certainly seeing lumber improve. And that factor is an important one, obviously, because of the sticks and bricks cost that it implies for housing. Now, we look at this a lot of different ways too. And at Builder 100, we had a CEO panel, and there was this up, down statement. And, the window lead time was really a focal point there. Look at this quote, going from 5 weeks to 25 weeks to currently 12 to 16 weeks. We're going to continue to monitor that, but there's actually some decent news on the horizon. In fact, look at the factors that we are querying every time we get together with the builders. There's been some level of improvement just over the last month. But let's look at it really from a year-over-year standpoint. Look left to right, that's about this time last year to now, you've seen that government services, supply, labor, land, they've all had more and more disruption. But look at the little gold line there, labor. There's been some level of improvement there. By no means are we saying, are we out of this? But incrementally, we're seeing it, and even our headline says it. Look, only 40% of builders reported a labor shortage last year. Now it's close to 80%. Continue to monitor it, but at least it's trending in a direction that is a little bit better. Now, as we ask about the key concerns, I don't think any of you are going to be surprised by the top 5, which, by the way, the top 5 are at the bottom of this graphic. And look at what it is. I mean, it's rising mortgage rates, affordability, cost, inflation, and land prices. No surprise, but here's what we have noticed. they've been more acute in the level of concern. And obviously mortgage interest rates have been a massive concern because we've seen over a 200 basis point increase, as you heard Ali talking about just a second ago. And Dana, you had asked a question online about how we define entry level, move up, and luxury. Well, I'm going to show you two different ways that both ends towards the middle end up similarly. This graphic gives you a sense of how Zillow looks at bottom tier, middle tier, top tier. Roughly, you could look at that as entry level, move up, and luxury. But what you're looking at is year over year price appreciation. By the way, that's me putting my hands on my face with my mouth going, oh my God. Look at the percentage. Now keep in mind, these are resale values. So they start lower than the new home price, but each sector has gone up pretty significant. When you're talking about the top tier going up 43% in Austin, as Ali was talking about, holy cow, that is a shock to the system. Now you can see the new home price, entry level, move up, luxury, and a similar level of increase in certain markets. But remember, the home price starts a little bit higher. So those percentage increases are a little different. Nonetheless, this is a shock to the system. We're paying a huge amount of attention to the lot and land information, and primarily because we want to see, are we going to be able to resupply the market? And if the market slows a little bit, what does it imply for the level of supply that we have in the pipeline? So the first thing that we're showing you here is the top 25 markets, and these are stacked by starts. So Dallas is the largest, Chicago is number 25. And it'll give you a sense of how the starts have changed over time. And you can see that primarily, most of the markets have had a pretty significant increase. Let's look at it graphically. Now, I always like to look at history because it gives us some perspective. And while we've had a pretty significant run up since 2022, our numbers, since 2020, our numbers are matching 2004. And there's been a lot of changes in the United States since 2004. And let me take a step back. I want to share with you something. I'm going to pause on this because what you're looking at is total building permits by year, 1960 to 2022. And let's just assume, and we can make arguments all day long about what the appropriate number is. Keep in mind, these are permits. And we're at about a 1.37 million average going from 1960 to 2020. Now, keep in mind, I've given you another perspective. These are permits. I just showed you starts before. But it's an interesting perspective for us to look at population growth and overlay that with permit activity. And as you look at the tranches from 90 to 2000, 2000 to 210, 210 to 220, you can see there's been this up and down and up and down. The market's never in perfect equilibrium, but over time, it finds itself. But the things that one of the key things I want to focus you on here is that if you do the math, and you could make any assumptions for the average of 1.37 million, but I think that's a pretty conservative number. And the implication here is we've got 1 million units undersupplied. And I know you could say, well, going back, it doesn't matter 20 years ago, but it's a quick perspective to prove one point, that there has been an undersupply situation. Whatever the number is, you can do your own math. But I want to bring up another element. Kim Lear, a sociologist that spoke at Builder 100, did an incredible job talking about our 4 sectors, the boomers who need to be motivated to move because they're locked in, as Ali was talking about. Gen X, they need time back. They're raising kids. What can you build to give them that? The millennials, they're networked and they need technology, but they've got to see something that they can ultimately afford. And then Gen Z, there's economic anxiety in that sector, in that category of age. And the key there is they're knocking on the door of making their own households. What do we do to get there? And one last thing to consider. If you think back to, let's just go to the year 2000. We had 282 million people in the United States at that time. We have 330 now. We've added almost 50 million people, and there's been an aging of the population. This presents unbelievable opportunities for us if you can decode what each of those sectors need by age, and also how to program product around it. All right, enough said. We do have a little bit of an issue because we are now in the sloth entitlement world. Everything is taking longer. And I think that confirms what all of you know, but the summary here is 98% of the builders are reporting longer cycle times. And we do have lots in the pipeline to help us. And notice that there's been a little shift over these last 3 months. This index gives you a sense of the new home lot supply. And keep in mind, 100 implies that we're in an equilibrium basis, meaning we have the lots that we need to supply demand. Well, we've been dropping precipitously for the last 7 years, 8 years, and now we flattened out. So it's really kind of an interesting factor to say, are we at a place where we're going to start bringing in the product that we need? Well, notice on the right-hand side, you can see the index value for each of these markets, and you can see the year-over-year change. Notice there is only one market that's had an increase. Look at Salt Lake City right in the middle, a 1% increase year over year in the index value. And I would attribute that to increasing supply, not a decreasing amount of demand. Let's dig a little bit deeper into this. Let's look at the lot supply that's in the pipeline. And we track it by road work, excavation, equipment on site. And when you're looking at equipment on site, that's the orange that you see right here. That's the stuff that's going to come to market the soonest. Well, it's only about 6% of our supply. But let me give you another quick perspective when you look at the first quarter 2022 numbers. If you assume we've got about 1 million lots in the pipeline and our permits were at 1.4, 1.5, that's less than a year's supply. Now, if we slow demand a little bit and we go back to 2014 numbers, when we're doing 550,000 permits, it's a 2-year supply. But again, we have to really dig that down into each of the submarkets. But on a very macro level, the perspective is, even with what we have in the pipeline, it is not oversupplied. And when we look at the markets by the location and by the status of the lots, you can see that with the exception of Tampa on a percentage basis, but really Tampa and Seattle have a little bit of hope there for product that's going to come in soon. But for the most part, the vast majority of the lots are still in the excavation standpoint. Now, a couple things to think about as we move into housing trends. First and foremost, the sticky factor, that compound factor, trying to get people to move. Think about this. The blue number is 65 years and older households, and the purple is 35 to 64. And this is the share of people who haven't moved since 1999. They haven't found a reason to. And keep in mind, many of them stay in place because their family's there, but also financial reasons, lower tax rates, lower interest rates. And Ali showed you a really important factor of that Black Knight information that, the percentage of households that have interest rate loans at around 3% is massive. So what are we going to do to create the compelling reason to get people to move? And one of the reasons and one of the justifications is new with energy efficiency, better utility. And in fact, if you look at the share of housing stock by year built, zero in on some of the markets where there's older supply. Look at that 1970 to 1990, LA, Minneapolis, Atlanta. Thomas James Homes, if you haven't heard of him, is creating a really interesting product profile of being able to go into markets where they're building one home at a time in markets that significantly are undersupplied, particularly in the upper end of the housing market. So they've got a really interesting niche that follows this factor on where the older product is and where they can improve it. Now, a couple things we want to share, when you're thinking about how buyers are responding to higher mortgage rates right now, here are some of the feedback we're getting from the builders. And it really comes down to a cautious element. Some buyers are still moving forward, particularly those that have locked in their mortgages, but others are a little bit more afraid and maybe even going to hold off for a while before they buy. And then on the negative side, we are seeing some indications that sales are slowing. And really the concept here is buying the smaller home. That last bullet is one of our arrows in the quiver of how to deal with the go forward element. Oh, you can't afford a 200 or a 2,600 square foot home? How about our 2350 model? And in fact, when you talk to Molly Carmichael, who oversees our consumer efforts, she is zeroing in on everything in the home and making sure that every dollar counts and the product that is put out is ideally identified and connected to that buyer profile. And as you can see, in just the last 3 years, generally we've seen home sizes go down in most markets. Now notice Tampa's a market where we've seen it actually inch up a little bit. Tampa is one of our most affordable markets. But I think if we do this over the next couple of years, we're going to see a continuing decline in the size of new homes, because that's one of our ways to battle affordability. And I can say that if you like ice cream like I like ice cream, we used to buy it in half-gallon containers, and now we've moved down to pint containers that are about the same price. And that's happened over time where we went from a gallon to a quart to a pint, and still people are buying ice cream. It's just that the ice cream is sometimes marketed and sometimes built and made better. Think about that. Compelling reason to buy ice cream. Relative value is something that Ali was challenging us on. And when you think about each of the markets that I'm presenting to you, this is detached, I'll show you attached in a second. Just think about, in fact, let me pull up attached for you, because when you're looking at the detached side, going LA to Denver, your dollar goes twice as far. If you're moving San Francisco to Salt Lake City, your dollar goes 50% further. But on the attached side, think about going from New York to Charlotte. I have a number of friends that have done that. If you stay in an attached home, your buying power is 5 times as important. Now, this is changing because prices are going up in all markets. Ali made a good point of that, but that's one element that we want to make sure you're paying attention to, is that compelling reason for people to move is often value and buying power. Once they're there, we've got to create a compelling product for them to be in. Now, before I jump into our final thoughts, I want to leave you with 3 things to think about as this market is shifting. John Covert, my associate who is in our Denver office and also within our advisory team, had one of his frames yesterday and was challenging the sales and marketing people to start their interest lists all over again. Start to reposition it and re-benchmark who your buyers are. Secondly, recommit to value engineering. You heard what Molly said. You know, every dollar counts. Understand what that consumer wants. And then ultimately use the data from who you're selling to and who you're marketing to, and democratize that data into your organization so you can make the decisions that need to be made for what consumers will pay for. Molly and Brent Harrington had a wonderful conversation at Builder 100 about the X factor. It's a little bit different in every market, but when it comes down to a great place, a compelling product, and a place that you feel safe and at home. So we always end with some good news, and here's a couple things that I want to point out. Coffee is finally defined as healthy for you. I am a huge coffee fan, and I just wanted to make sure you all know that medically proven, if you drink more coffee, you'll live a longer life, and I can tell you, you'll certainly be more happy. Now, this next one is a little bit geeky on the biology side, but you know, after decades of efforts, the genome has been mapped. And why do we care? By looking at our DNA, we can also understand ahead of time what we're prone to acquire in our older years. Are we potentially going to have lupus? Could we have any other significant issues? And being able to map this genome allows us to get ahead of the factors. And on a personal basis, think about this. These 2 gentlemen, they were in concentration camps together 80 years ago in Nazi Germany. And Jack and Sam knew each other there and lost each other in 1943. And just recently at a US Holocaust Memorial Museum, there was a presentation by one of them. The other saw the Ron, and they connected. And suddenly these 2 friends, after 80 almost years, reconnected. Talk about the love that they would feel seeing their brother again. Now, there was a whole bunch of conversation about people in COVID pulling away and, oh my gosh, you know, nobody wants to talk to anybody, nobody cares anymore. Well, check this out. Americans donated a record amount of money during the pandemic. And when I found this, I wanted to share it with you because this is a spin on COVID. I think most human beings were looking at how difficult it was and how frightening it was, and they put their pocketbooks out there. That to me is an amazing story. Now, don't get grossed out by this, but we always talk about 3D printing in housing. Well, in science, Dr. Anthony Atala has created, using human cells, an actual human ear. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's going to lead the path into much more complex elements like hearts and kidneys. But this ear is for a wounded warrior who lost his ear in an explosion. And what this offers for people who have had any type of deformities or lost parts of their body, or for longevity, an incredible opportunity. And last but not least, I mentioned lupus earlier. This has actually been in my family, both MS and lupus. And there's researchers have gotten to the genetic connection in lupus. To me, this kind of research is so amazing. Once again, it speaks to longevity and the incredible research that's being done all over the world in the science community. So inspiration, let's talk about that before we go. Oh, wait, how did that get here? Oops, sorry. Inspiration, let me start over. Inspiration, the person that we chose today is this football player on the right-hand side. His name is Donnie Edwards. He played for years with the San Diego Chargers and then the Chiefs. And wondering, what does a football player have to do with this? Well, he's got his arm around Tom Rice. Tom Rice is now a 100-year-old former Army man, was in the Battle of the Bulge. And Donnie realized, because of his love for the history of the military, he created a nonprofit organization called the Best Defense Foundation. Well, what does the Best Defense Foundation do? Well, it takes World War II veterans back to Pearl Harbor, and he's got coming up in Normandy in June, he's taken another 50 of these vets to see where they had been. Most of them haven't been back since World War II, and to experience the camaraderie of being with their people again. They get a chance to meet current military people. But by the way, the person on the lower left is a friend of mine. His name is Gil. Gil was on a ship in World War II and at Pearl Harbor. Notice Gil's about 4'5" now. But the thing that I want to point out the most is that what this has done for the families of these veterans, who, by the way, Donnie has shared with me that of the people that went on this Pearl Harbor run back in December, they've lost 20% of them already, because most of them are in their mid and late 90s. But the element that is so compelling is the impact this has, not just on the vets, but on their kids and grandkids. What the families learn about the service that these men and women put forward, and also just being able to hear the stories, often for the first time. And it's for that reason that we put out Donnie Edwards as our inspiration. Not only a football player and a really cool dude, but also giving acknowledgement and respect where it should go. With that, ladies and gentlemen, given our time, I want to let you know we are going to wrap up, but note right here that you can subscribe to any of the factors that we're putting out, Zonda Home, and we've got survey questions, including we want to ask you guys for what you think the new name of these presentations should be. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, go forward, have a great time today, have a wonderful weekend, and keep in mind what we said, create a compelling place. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon and see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.